While I've rather haphazardly covered a vast majority of MechWarrior games out there, and yes, I do actually plan on doing more, I haven't actually got around to tackling the bevy of clones that exist. But most of the time, calling them clones is sort of a reach. Many games were labeled as such, especially when it came to those released after MechWarrior 2, but I wouldn't say that it's exactly fair to call any mech simulator a clone, at least not in a genuine sense. Fact is, before the 1989 MechWarrior, there just weren't many, if any, mech simulation games. So literally every first-person experience pertaining to a mech could theoretically be called a clone in some way or another. I guess you could say the statement is just plain redundant. And if you haven't guessed already, the game I'm covering today, Terra Nova Strike Force Centauri, just happened to be considered a clone of MechWarrior 2 upon its release in 1996. And while it certainly is a mech simulator, clearly inspired by the original MechWarrior, I wouldn't say that it borrowed much from MechWarrior 2 directly, considering its origins stem all the way back to 1992, but more from the Battletech universe itself. In fact, I'd say it's more of a story-focused and far more streamlined version of Earthsiege, if anything, and it's barely even that. In fact, it's so streamlined that if you were to ask me what mech simulation a newcomer to the genre should start with, I'd likely just suggest Terra Nova. Why would I say something like that? Well, you're going to have to watch this video to find out. And hey, if you like a bunch of odd science fiction related retro gaming videos, why not like and subscribe while you're at it? It is doubtlessly the best way to support this channel without having to spend a single dime. Of course, I'd also like to shout out Benjamin for this one, who graciously gifted me Terra Nova through GOG for this review. You're awesome, Benjamin. I'm sorry this one took so long to finish. Without a doubt, Terra Nova's storyline draws inspiration from the Battletech universe. Most noticeably, it carries the same concept of clans. In this context, the term refers to 12 colonies that left Earth's solar system to settle in Alpha Centauri. They did this after a domineering government called the Hegemony started annexing colonies across the Milky Way. And I know, even though it's said hegemony, no one in the game actually says that.
The Hegemony.
The Hegemony has no forces stationed in your system.
Each of these colonies form a special strike force to create a network of defense against looming pirate forces, and no wonder, as pirates in Terra Nova's universe are depicted as brutal plunderers who steal, kill, and even kidnap children for almost completely unknown reasons.
Pirates are pirates.
You've dealt with pirates before.
They attacked our plantation, killed my parents, forced my brother and I to watch. After a while, I stopped watching and did something. Picked up my father's hunting carbine and just kept pulling the trigger.
As the game progresses, the player learns just how vile their actions can be, and several of the game's central characters' motivations are all tied to the horrific acts.
What happened, Maggie?
I'm 232 years old, that's what happened. The pirates, that's what happened. We went into hibernation for the trip out here. Navigation went to hell and we drifted.
For 200 years.
While we slept, pirates stole my family.
So though this idea of space clans is reminiscent of Battletech, it diverges significantly aside from the terminology. Here there are no cloning or breeding programs or genetic legacies guiding overall motivations. These are just colonies existing outside of a terrible government. There is a wealth of lore within this game that delves into this universe's history, a completely different beast from Battletech altogether. Though the lore might feel a bit undercooked for fans of that franchise due to the game being a fresh storyline with no pre-existing source books, novels, or video games to draw from, which in all honesty does take a lot of pressure off of new players, so I consider that a good thing. Much of the game's story is told through FMV cutscenes, with occasional emails from superiors or comrades. Here you play as Nicola Apio, selected alongside your brother Brant to be part of a new system-wide strike force called Alpha Centauri. While Nicola isn't a very interesting character, likely due to his role as the game's straight man, the characters around him are at least entertaining.
I thought about taking a job in the council like your mom.
Am I acting interested?
But they needed me here. And Sarah, I just go where I'm needed.
I need you to get away from me.
Ouch.
It's important to note that while story-based games were big in 1996, with the adventure genre still being a mainstream draw, it would be a long time before the world reached the level of cinematic storytelling we experience today. Most stories in older games like Terra Nova were written by developers and programmers, sometimes even acted out by the staff putting the project together. But this game aimed for a more professional set of writers and actors, though the degree of professionality is somewhat debatable.
I'm looking for Commander McPherson.
You found him, son. Drop and give me 20.
Sir?
What? The pirates steal your ears? Better yet, make it 40.
David Albert and Bill Doyle crafted the narrative. Albert, who worked on the story and manuals for other titles, developed the universe and its lore, while Bill Doyle, now a writer for Scholastic, scripted the game's cutscenes. Though it might be amusing that one of the game's writers is an accomplished children's author, Doyle's skill eventually earned him a career, so whether or not he settled on children's stories, the man did know how to write. From what I could gather, no staff members were actually used in Terra Nova's voice or FMV scenes. Actual actors, most with at least a little bit of experience in the industry, did the bulk of the acting. I personally think they did a good job, possibly because my expectations for mech storylines are very low. Seeing an effort to make the world feel alive and lived in, rather than relying on an ambient approach common in simulation games at the time, was refreshing. The story is rather straightforward, with Terra Nova's opening featuring a ship commandeered by pirates. It turns out this ship contains a special type of weapon called a Petrov's grenade, though their importance is barely explained aside from a few entries in the player's dormitory user terminal. A clan council decides to assemble the aforementioned strike force to retrieve them, with one member expressing such faith in the endeavor that she adds her own daughter to the roster. Rather than stating it outright, tensions are expressed through character actions. Terra Nova tries its best to do this as much as possible with its story, taking a far less expository approach, which is certainly something I can appreciate. Beginning the game with a set of bickering leaders, completely disagreeing on how to deal with the situation at hand, is a pretty great way to set up Terra Nova's tale of distrust and uneasy alliances. It's clear that this branch of the galaxy has been dealing with the pirate threat for so long that their options and resources have been steadily dwindling. And I'd go so far as to say this touch of show don't tell was rarely seen in games at the time, or rarely done in a way that showed that the game's writers actually tried to create a half-decent narrative to back up the gameplay. Aside from a few introduction scenes, much of the game centers around interactions between its many characters. The Centauri Strike Force itself is composed of the expected archetypes. If you've seen Aliens or Starship Troopers, you know what I mean. The straight man, Joker, hard-ass, willful revenger, they're all here and more. I don't wholly mind these types of characters, especially when they're indicative of the time, but even so, the narrative struggles to use them in a meaningful or interesting way. None of them are all that interesting after their tragic backstories are revealed. As soon as they become actually noteworthy, they are suddenly pushed aside so that the main plot can unfold. Unless they are actively part of the central plot, they simply fade into the background. It becomes such a consistent problem that eventually the game's bartender character has more lines than any other character, aside from Nikolai and his commander McPherson, and that's only because the writers clearly wanted the player to believe this guy was a double agent, but he's such an obvious red herring that even a preschooler wouldn't have been fooled. Because of this shunning of side characters, I barely even realized that Brant was Nicola's brother until halfway through the game. Perhaps there was this assumption that the player would develop a connection through the game's missions, but even as I say that, it seems like such a reach. About halfway through the game, the obvious happens. The hegemony has been supplying the pirates. A council member, Pantheus, has been acting on their behalf to weaken the colonies so that they might annex Alpha Centauri. Immediately, they declare war on the clans, and the real story of Terra Nova begins. Despite the gameplay centering around mech suits and fast-paced encounters, the plot focuses on uncovering a conspiracy within the ranks, with Nikola having to expose a mole within his team. After being captured by Pentheus, who wishes to use his body as spare parts for the hegemony's clone forces, he is informed that a traitor exists within their ranks. Sadly, before escaping, the joker of the team, Schuler, who also showed quite a bit of disdain towards Nikola, dies in the rescue. This doesn't only mark where the game starts to shift gears with its overall story, but also how it's told. Schuler's death takes place not in an FMV, but actually during gameplay, and so do a lot of plot points from here on out. This sort of cinematic storytelling using the in-game world was extremely rare, and I can't personally think of any game that did this much of it at the time. In fact, experiencing what Terra Nova did with its in-game world, despite the story not exactly being groundbreaking, is probably worth the price of entry alone. When Nicola's aforementioned brother Brant finally starts to crawl out of the woodwork, it's due to suspicions of a team member poisoning Commander McPherson. Tension grows between them as Brant often sneaks off for reasons he doesn't want to personally disclose. Sadly, it quickly becomes another of the game's red herring plot threads. In the end, Brant is revealed to have caught a little religion, something he used to get through after he and Nicola's parents died. He wasn't yet comfortable with sharing that fact with his brother, even though sharing this rather mundane fact likely would have stopped his brother from seeing him as a potential double agent. Another red herring runs alongside Brant's subplot, casting suspicion on Sarah Walker, the only councilwoman's daughter. Her and her mother had some shady agreements with the pirates at some point, which initially seemed rather interesting. Yet when McPherson finally succumbs to poisoning, marking the death of a second side character in the game, she takes his place as commander and the whole thing falls flat. Rather, Terra Nova immediately sends Nicola on a stealth mission, piloting a pirate's suit in order to discover who the actual double agent is. And it ends up being the short, bald, and opinionated Ashford. No hate on his baldness, or shortness of course. Lord knows my hairline has lost a few inches over the years, but I couldn't help but feel like making the most annoying character in the game, the double agent, was a little obvious.
Pirate number 3? He doesn't have time to wet his suit before I'm bouncing over the hill, heading with my particle beam.
And then you woke up.
Excuse me? Excuse me.
Can we help you?
Speak up, boy.
Now, I'll admit that I didn't actually see that coming, but he also had barely enough screen time to actually form an opinion on the character at all. Being caught, Ashford decides that the only way out of his situation doesn't involve the stairs, and so Terra Nova's conspiracy elements end rather haphazardly. What's left? Well, a final battle that ends with the hegemony retreating, only to lay the blame on Pentheus, framing him as a rogue, acting on his own accord using hegemony resources. They essentially get away with everything before replacing Pentheus with a new ambassador, leaving the player with a bittersweet conclusion hinting that likely the hegemony will be back. Terra Nova feels more like a multi-episode arc in a television series rather than a complete story. There is so much about this game that feels as if it was supposed to be part of a further series, and in fact it apparently was supposed to be just that. However, despite selling over 100,000 units, Looking Glass Technologies wasn't able to cover the game's development costs, leading to a major loss on their part. This loss was so significant that the studio had to look for investors, eventually being acquired by Intermetrics. Officially, Looking Glass became Intermetrics Entertainment Software, but managed to retain the Looking Glass name by using the trade name Looking Glass Studios. And for those not familiar with what a trade name is, it's basically a pseudonym or a pen name if you like for companies not wanting to operate under their official name. So in all likelihood, Looking Glass wasn't too happy with the name change Intermetrics forced upon them. In my humble opinion, this whole interaction was quite odd to me. Looking at the information at hand, Intermetrics, later Averstar, was involved with a lot of high-level utilitarian computer programs. This company was even founded by programmers responsible for NASA's Apollo program, so what they wanted with a video game development studio is beyond me. My only theory is that they knew the appeal of video games and thought it would be a worthwhile stream of revenue, so that they might fund more sophisticated projects. But whatever the case, this did result in Looking Glass Technologies becoming the legendary Looking Glass Studios, allowing them to develop a sequel to one of their previous titles, the absolutely unforgettable System Shock. What, did I not mention that the developers of Terra Nova were also responsible for System Shock? Well, they were. The sequel would be undeniably flawed, just as much as, if not more, memorable than the original. They would go on to develop the first two Thief games alongside a few other entries in their Flight Unlimited series and some forgettable N64 ports.
Capture the sensation of war with Command & Conquer for your N64.
These very ports would drive publishers away, leading to the cancellation of several other titles. Eventually, Intermetrics would grow tired of the losses and cut ties, ultimately spooking Eidos, Sony, and Microsoft, and eventually leading to the studio's closure. It isn't hard to see that Terra Nova, due to its financial failure, was the first domino in Looking Glass's fall. Had the game not been released only a year after MechWarrior 2 and right before the Windows version of Ghost Bear's Legacy, there's a small chance it might have done just a little bit better. All of that aside, it might seem a bit odd that Looking Glass went the route of a linear, story-driven mech simulator, especially after a more open action RPG like System Shock. But really, I'd say that Terra Nova represents a mishmash of their best working concepts at the time. Looking Glass was the product of Learner Research and Blue Sky Productions merging, combining two teams of sim and RPG developers together. Blue Sky itself had developed Ultima Underworld and a football game of all things, while Learner strictly leaned on simulators, finding a lot of success with its flight sims and their plainly titled Car and Driver. A lot of the broader mechanics seen in these titles would be reworked to develop System Shock, especially Ultima Underworld, which was undeniably a sim-influenced title mixed with RPG elements. Many loved System Shock, but it was and still is a very difficult game for newcomers. That and its broad storytelling can be really difficult for some people to grasp. Terra Nova takes a similar gameplay concept and style and leans heavily on the action. It seems like Looking Glass really wanted to flip the dead world concept of System Shock on its head to create a more alive and functioning universe. That is, rather than the one implied in scattered ship logs and voice memos. So in a lot of ways, it's the antithesis of that game's storytelling, being absolutely direct, open, and communicative with the player about what's going on, yet still playing a lot like System Shock and Ultima Underworld mechanically. Playing Terra Nova in the 2020s isn't a horrible experience. It's very much like a faster-paced System Shock, completely focused on action. It is functionally very sound. There isn't much that holds a player back with the absolute monster PCs we operate, especially in comparison to those used in 1996. So imagine my surprise when I found out that this game, which appears far less system-intensive visually than MechWarrior 2, was basically the crisis of its time. Yes, Terra Nova, despite using mostly 2D sprites for everything but the environments and looking way more dated than even Doom, was far too intensive for systems at the time. That's what you call bad optimization. While I might have enjoyed the game, playing it on a system about 1,000 times more powerful than it was meant to be used on, I can't imagine choosing this over MechWarrior 2. Visually, that game was far more superior. Mechanically, it was also far more superior. Those who were able to run the game effectively did enjoy it, and it was well received. Personally, I love the action-oriented and far more fast-paced gameplay. This is mostly because it differed from MechWarrior 2. Terra Nova really does have its own identity, favoring fast-paced gunfights and quick strike ambushes. They weren't kidding when they called it Strike Force Centauri. Its squad system is also far less obtuse than MechWarrior's StarMate system. In fact, if there was one big improvement I loved with the fourth game, it was how much it improved squad control. However, Terra Nova was doing something similar far before that title. Allied AI is, for the most part, extremely competent and will follow your every command. Some even have unique actions they can perform, such as contextual instances of hijacking satellites or turrets, though most special actions within the game depend on what you've equipped an ally with, and even that can only be truly effective if that character is a certain type of specialist. While all of this is cool, and it's a bit ahead of its time, I wouldn't say that it functions as intended either. Most of the time, allies are most useful as additional targets for your enemies, or an extra bit of firepower when taking down some of the game's later variants. That or just making the destruction of a building less agonizingly long. Look, it was 1996 and I'm pretty new to the concept of squad-based combat at the time, so to me at least this does sound like it was a pretty astonishing thing to play around with. Of course, while most missions do boil down to going somewhere and either destroying enemies, convoys, or buildings, there are missions that branch out further. MechWarrior 2 did have a few of these unique missions, such as Ghost Bear's underwater level, but Terra Nova really wins out when it comes to these. As I mentioned earlier, there are missions that include important story moments outside of strictly FMVs. These can include stealth missions, which are surprisingly okay, protecting a downed vessel, or even disguising yourself as a pirate. None of these overstay their welcome, and I wouldn't say that they were so difficult that I was annoyed. As I mentioned, Terra Nova's stealth missions were surprisingly fun, as they let the player play around with more situation-oriented equipment. But with that, I do regrettably have to mention the bad. Probably the most egregious being the sheer amount of useless items here. Unlike its contemporary, which allows for players to buy whatever they want so long as they have the C-bills, Terra Nova unlocks weapons as the story progresses. This severely cuts down on variety for a good portion of the game, and even so, what you unlock is rarely that much better than the last thing. You really just get the basic gamut of weapons with a sci-fi mech paint job, and because of this, Terra Nova can feel more like an FPS than a full-blooded sim. Making things worse, some equipment doesn't feel as if it has any effect on the battlefield at all. Items like EMP grenades don't seem to do anything, drones and turrets are a really good concept, done really well, but you are never going to use either of these in fast-paced encounters, because honestly, there is little to no reason to plan out your next move in a game consisting of fast-paced strikes. Everything happens so fast that the only actual planning needed is deciding which objective to hit first. But now that I'm putting this video together, I realize that that isn't that much bad at all, and I'm sure there are Uber fans out there that know exactly how to put these items to use in any situation, or maybe not. Now, if you're interested in the game, it does go for about $5.99 on GOG. However, it's almost always on sale for $1 or $2. If anything I've said about Terra Nova seems interesting, it wouldn't be a bad thing to sink a few dollars and a weekend on. Who knows, it could be the welcome mech warrior break you need, much as it was for me, or a much needed dose of originality in a Steam library full of bland modern games. Certainly, I think Terra Nova is more than worth the price of admission. Are you going to buy this? Or have you already played it? I'm Kei-Nova, thank you for watching another video, and I'll see you in the next one.